Yes, 100%.
Tell me twice.
All right, roll. Could have been a quick meeting. All right.
Bye, Troy.
This close to me.
We'll call to order the Wednesday, July 5th meeting of the Committee of the Whole. Clerk, would you please call the roll? Here.
Petty. Here. Malaco.
Here.
Right.
Here.
Simon.
Here.
Babcock.
Here.
Gustafson. Here.
Thank you. And we have a motion to approve the minutes from the June 20th Committee of the Whole meeting. Motion trustee Wright, second trustee Simon. Any questions or discussion? Clerk, will you call the roll?
Right.
Yes.
Petty. Yes. Malaco.
Yes.
Block.
Yes.
Simon.
Yes.
Babcock.
Yes. Public comment. Ken? Mike? Hey, nothing? Hey, nothing? I don't think there's anyone online with their hand up or anything. We'll just go into new business. We only have one item, 5.1, discussion and recommendation to the board for approval of entering into an agreement with ClearGov Inc. for municipal budgeting software, including operational, capital, and personnel budgeting, and the transparency portal. The transparency portal is something, this is a company we already have an agreement with. The transparency portal is a link at the bottom of our website that basically shows the public all of our revenues and expenditures at any given time. We have currently only subscribed to that portion with them of just the transparency portal. They do have a robust and impressive package for collectively managing the budgeting process, including developing long-range plans with respect to capital improvements and potential fluctuations or goals personnel. Joe's run point on this. Do you have anything you want to?
Just that I think we've looked at several software packages. I don't know if anybody's looked at the transparency module currently or recently or at all. But this will look in the transparency module. This syncs up about once every quarter, every month or so, we'll update our budget. Currently, we don't have the system yet, but we'll update the budget so we'll match up with the transparency module, which gives all the public, which gives everybody a chance to see exactly sort of those reports that you're seeing right now from Steve. The year-to-dates will be on there, where they break down, where they fall in, what departments, what works, police department, how they break apart. You can play with them, you can move them around as much as you need to, very visual, or you can just download the sheet of it and sort of see all that. And so this will be sort of the next step of that is us using that as our budgeting platform. So we can actually start preparing those in the future. So we'll do operational budgeting, and we'll do, which of course we do right now in spreadsheets, which it works, but it's a lot of manual input, a lot of manual changing. It will also allow us to do personnel budgeting. And what's nice about the personnel module, I think it might be on too, but it will allow us to see all the changes when we add police officers, add public works, change salaries, do raises. It will show us how that reflects across all the different items, vacation pay, sick time, longevity, all the different possible options that are out there. Allow us to really sort of see that without doing all that manual work that we're doing currently, which I think will be very helpful for everybody for sort of planning out your hirings. And finally, it does have a capital budgeting module on there as well, which really haven't done a lot of, sort of the longer range planning, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. When we're into replacement schedules, new trucks, new cars, new equipment, anything, all of that, taking care of the leasing, take care of all the capital planning, and sort of get us a handle on the future projects. So that's where we're looking at this. This company specializes in municipal budgeting. That's what they do, is all municipalities, many municipalities across the country. They work with. Yep. So that is sort of why we've gone with this, sort of looked at them. When we had the sort of relationship with them, we've sort of used them in the transparency module, and then we looked at several other products. And this seemed like one where everybody could sort of get added to it, use it. Department heads will be able to use it, trustees will be able to use it, see what's going on. That was our fire recommendation. There's a good breakdown in the folder.
If you haven't, I encourage you, between now and the board meeting to review that 20-page software proposal. It really does a nice job of spelling out the features and the benefits.
What's the difference?
So it's not replacing any current programs that we have. So
Correct.
there's
Currently, it's just spreadsheets we're using.
it's gonna be a definite payoff in ROI and time and
Right. And we will be able to import data from the Excel system
Correct.
that is currently used. And the demonstration was advertised as being user-friendly and would allow all staff members here easy access to it. You're smirking, but to quote them, 8th grade, everything here was projected. If you achieve to an 8th grade level, you would be able to get into the system and maneuver the system and work adequately with it. And it also provides, not that it's always about bells and whistles, but you get all the nice graphics that can be part of the transparency. A lot easier to communicate with individuals, by pie chart or whatever, where the money comes from and where it goes. And trends also.
What budget is that coming out of? We didn't budget for this, did we?
IT contractual.
Right. So the implementation cost, look at the breakdown, would just be the first year, then the second year for the subscription service. 13, 7, 13, 15, so total. Right, that first year, 16,053, 13.
Correct.
Compare that compared favorably to some other
Right,
quotes received.
I'll make a motion that we send this on to the board.
Second it.
Motion by trustee Plock, second by trustee Petty. Any further discussion, questions?
Will we see benefits this year, or is it gonna be like this year's the rollout, next year we'll start seeing it?
What I would say is that you, the trustees, will see benefits in the form of improved information delivery. I suspect that any new software platform, the first year is bumpy and the learning curve is always more than projected, so.
But they tell you what kind of onboarding expectations have.
I not participate.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to have it in place by this budget season. So we'll have it in place by the budget season. We've got training. Part of the quote on here, it's a little more than originally was, but the part of the quote is to do the onboarding, the training sessions. We'll bring all of our current data in, help us work through all the current charts of accounts we have, get all that old information in there, work through our Cassell. Cassell is our current software for our financial software here. They are a partner with Cassell as well. They have a relationship where they can import that directly into there. So that first year, yeah, it's going to be training. It's going to be a learning curve for department heads and for the staff. But
I only said that in response to will we see benefit this year. You will see benefit this year. Well, I think internally from staff, greater benefit in years to come.
Yeah. Once everything
becomes
is,
the
yeah.
norm, once we're used to using it. Sure, it'll be an interesting implementation, but that would be the expected thing. So it will empower a lot more people to participate in the budget preparation. A lot more department heads to have direct access to their modules, to insert their information and their supporting data that is accessible by all and can be packaged into reports in a lot of different ways. It brings cooks to the kitchen, but that's a good thing in this case.
this is also the package that did not have the drop-down feature. There is a certain line item and a dollar amount that is there. You could in the window, drop down and see specifically even what the PO was.
Yeah, it helps
Or what
build,
that
yeah, to
particular
build the
item
actual
was.
overall.
So it doesn't have to be something reproduced, scanned and put in docs, just all is there in one place.
Clerk, call the roll.
Babcock,
Yes.
Petty,
Yes.
Wright,
Yes.
Simon.
Yes.
Block,
Yes.
Malcolm.
Yes.
Motion approved 6-0. Thank you. Old business? Hearing none, we have some brief presentations tonight. I am tasked with zoning, basics of zoning and land use, and I will say at the onset, we will be broad and brief this evening because zoning deserves multiple presentations. There's a lot there, and to try to tackle it all in one night would not be advisable. So what I want to do is talk about zoning, like very broad brush, like zoning for dummies. What is zoning, right? And so zoning is a collection of laws and ordinances that allow the village or any given municipality the ability to regulate development in given defined zones or districts throughout its boundaries. Big picture, the only entities that have zoning, that have the zoning authority are individual municipalities, so any incorporated municipality, and then everything outside of that falls to the county. You'll hear a lot of people say, I live in the township. And that's true. Everyone lives in a township. Townships themselves do not have ordinances that govern any development. So if you're in the village limits of Roscoe, then you follow our code of ordinances. If you are one property outside of that limit, you follow Winnebago County. So you are considered part of unincorporated Winnebago County. And it's a confusing thing for a lot of people. They might have a Roscoe mailing address, which really all that means is their mail is delivered from the Roscoe post office. It doesn't mean they live in Roscoe. Some people don't even want to, some people will argue that point, believe it or not, even though you can show them their tax bill. But that's important to know that you're either in a municipality or the county governs other than that. Zoning allows municipality to establish tools to guide the orderly development of its community and to advocate for the highest and best land use and further establish goals for growth. You'll hear the term, and I write it down because you see it written out often in findings of fact. The overarching highest assessment of what zoning is our effort to protect health, safety, and general welfare of the public. You'll see that written into a lot of things. So it's kind of a guiding goal for everything. So we divide our municipality into districts. You have some information in your package that shows what the different in the board folders that shows what our different districts are. The way most municipalities divide them will have broad categories of residential, commercial, and industrial. And then within those broad categories, they'll be broken down further. So in residential, we have R1, single family, R2, which is duplexes, and then RM, which allows construction of multifamily units above 2. By the way, R2 would apply. Industrial, we have commercial, we have 4 different districts, and each one they go from sort of most restrictive to least restrictive. CO is probably the most restrictive one, commercial office, and that really only allows the development of office space, a professional office space. It does not allow for direct any sales or retail engagement. That goes into the next one, which is commercial retail, which is somewhat self-explanatory, but that brings into play all retail, all direct sales and transactions to the public on premises. Commercial general is even broader than the commercial retail. It isn't exactly this, but one distinction that I often point to from commercial retail to commercial general, we just had a map amendment request for that down the street, is the inclusion of automotive uses. Virtually no automotive uses, be it sales, service, gas station, car wash, anything having to do with vehicles are not permitted uses in CR, commercial retail, but they're all allowed in CG, commercial general. And then most broad is commercial highway. And that aligns pretty closely with commercial general, but allows things to happen at bigger scales and allows for higher density of development of a property. And those exist only in select parcels adjacent to either I-90 or 250. Right. Then in industrial, we have light industrial, general industrial, heavy industrial. Now they're scattered throughout, so I didn't try to print them all, but I'd encourage you to go to our website. The zoning ordinance is on the website, of course. But in each of those uses, residential, commercial, industrial, there'll be a table that identifies uses. And the uses will fall into three categories generally. There'll be permitted uses. If something's identified as a permitted use in any given zoning district, it's permitted by right, and we have very little say over it. We'll approve. It'll go through a process called design review, which only speaks to really the appearance and the code compliance, but it isn't a yes or no, can this use happen? I'll talk about design review in a minute. But it's something that everyone's allowed to do. Then there are special uses. That is, those are uses that are, it can be contemplated for approval in that district on a case-by-case basis. It's never a guarantee, but an applicant would come forward and appeal to the village to develop something in a use that falls into a use of the property that's categorized as a special use. Then we sometimes go so far as to identify prohibited. If we feel very strongly that something cannot occur in a zoning district, there can be prohibited uses. It then grants some authority, some broader interpretation authority to the zoning administrator, and which in this case is me. I have the role of zoning administrator as well as village administrator. But the zoning administrator can make some assessment over a proposed use that doesn't look like it maybe lines up with anything listed in the table. However, the zoning administrator can never, by their own discretion, make something permitted. Right? If we could say there's something that could be brought forward as a special use for consideration. The by right permitted uses are only those established in the tables. Within each district, there'll be their own set of rules that might govern development, specific to residential, specific to commercial, specific to industrial, and they will vary. They'll address a lot of the same topics, but they'll address. You heard me mention a coverage ratio, a lot coverage ratio. That's how much of that lot can be impervious, how much of that lot can be paved, and that varies significantly. In residential, it's only up to 25%. You have 75% of your residential lot must be a permeable surface, right? Typically lawn or planting areas. Some of our zoning districts get up to, or some of our industrial districts get up to 80% at least, right?
The parking.
Yeah, we just acknowledge that the industrial uses, and of course by zoning, we try to locate those appropriately so that they are not adjacent to an incompatible use. But yes, we anticipate more intense usage of the property, and therefore there's probably a lot more building square footage and affiliated paved square footage. A critical step, and we talked about this already, but a critical first step in any zoning is to have an adopted comprehensive land use plan. Zoning is meant to further the goals established by a community. So it's important to establish what those goals are and to agree upon what those goals are. I look forward very much to going through this process. We'll have it started by fall. I expect it to be a year-long process, to be honest with you. By the time we go through this, there are a lot of components of it governed by state statute, and there is public engagement. There are community presentations. There are surveys and soliciting of information. And I think it will strengthen our ability to evaluate proposals moving forward. And it will more than likely result in updates or tweaks to our zoning ordinance following the adoption of a new comprehensive land use plan. A couple of the other sections that are sort of broad, so I thought they were appropriate for discussion tonight and for inclusion in your board are, I think I put in the first few sections, which are very brief, that basically just establish the authority or what rights do we have to even create zoning districts here as a municipality. But general provisions and use provisions, I included those because they're pretty broad as well. General provisions are rules in place that govern aspects of development, aspects of construction that might be applicable across all districts that aren't specific to one district. Now, they might have, that use might have different sets of rules per district, and those would be delineated in that section. But it's just taking a broad look at things that probably apply across a lot of different districts. And so does the use provisions. General provisions speak to construction and to design standards. How can something build? How big it? I often describe to residents that zoning governs, answers these three questions. Can I do the thing I want to do at the location I want to do it, at the size I want to do it? Really, it distills down almost to that. Can I do these? Can I do the thing I want to do? Can I do it here? Can I do it at this size? And the use provisions get into sometimes, can I do the thing I want to do? Right? Is it an appropriate use for the district? And use provisions, that section 8 in our ordinance that you have a PDF of, that sets up rules for uses, again, that we anticipate might be applicable across many different districts that aren't specific to a singular district. Therefore, those rules don't reside strictly in the commercial or residential or zoning sections. The perfect example we have before us tonight is the solar ordinance. We anticipate that solar will happen across every district we have in one way or the other eventually. And again, either as we defined in our ordinance as an accessory use, meaning solar is being attached to an existing business or residence as a way to supplement their energy production and usage, or as a primary use. It's the main business. The business is generating solar energy. So that's the updated ordinance you approved tonight speaks to solar as a use. It could happen across many districts. And that it could, if you look through it, the uses apply to everything from beekeeping to urban gardening to accessory structures, because accessory structures are something that happens in every different zoning district, the solar and many more. I want to touch briefly then upon also, it goes hand in hand with our zoning, is the zoning board of appeals. And you've all had some level of interaction with the zoning board of appeals. But the zoning board of appeals is a recommending body to you, to the village board. It's an appointed board. We appointed a new member tonight. And they are the first step to review the appropriateness or the compliance of any given proposal. Now they can serve a couple different functions, right there in their name, zoning board of appeals. It's a board to which someone would first appeal a zoning decision or a zoning rule. I don't want to, or I cannot comply for some reason with the zoning rules you've established. I want to appeal those. Zoning board of appeals would hear those first. That would more than likely come in the form of a variance request. There are 3 or 4 things that originate at the zoning board of appeals and then advance on to you, the committee of the whole, and then the village board. Those 4, if there's another one, Joe, you can point it out, but the 4 that happen most frequently are a special use permit request, which we just talked about. This is, I want to do this business here, and it's only allowed by special use. So that originates at a public hearing, the zoning board of appeals. For all of the things I mentioned here, there's a notice requirement of posting the request in a newspaper of daily circulation, of posting the property itself, and of sending out a mailing to every to every property that exists within 300 feet of the subject property. And if 1 inch of a property is within 300 feet of 1 inch of the subject property, they make that list. We have tools available at our disposal to make it very easily to buffer a property out 300 feet and automatically generate a list of the properties that are impacted. And it always surprises me, especially on residential ones, that you would think, well, there's maybe 8, 10, 12 houses around me that will fall into that list, but it's usually something like 40 that are within 300 feet of any given property, especially on residential lots. Special use permits, that That is a recommendation that happens at the zoning board of appeals and moves on. Map amendments, that's a change to our zoning map. Anyone wants to change the zoning of their property. That starts at zoning board of appeals, then it's a recommendation on to the committee. Text amendments, we did that tonight. Text amendment is a change to the zoning rules themselves. Those are generally, the applicant is going to almost always be us, but those requests might begin from a resident or in this case, well, solar ordinance is something that we were going to need to adopt anyway. We were nudged along in this case by a potential development, right? And we wanted to make sure we got out ahead of that and set up the rules to govern that. And the variance is the last one. And the variance is someone again saying, I want to do something outside that does not comply with ordinance, right? We had one. So all of these, we've had examples of all of these. You guys have already heard all of these, all 4 of them. We had a special use permit for the open air pavilion. We had a variance request saying we would prefer not to pave the parking lot for ordinance right away. We have a variance to that. I think we've even, I don't know if it was for this board, was Sens insurance this board or not, but there was a variance request to not do curb and gutter. Our ordinance requires curb and gutter around all parking lots now, and sometimes we'll get a variance request to waive that in whole or in part. Map amendment, we had 2 of those over the last couple of meetings, both of which ended up being denied, but those advanced out of committee of the whole, or excuse me, out of the ZBA, one with a favorable recommendation, one with a recommendation to deny. There was the 2 parcels down the road on Main Street. Those both came to you. So you guys have already seen all 4 of these main actions that move on from the ZBA and come to you. So are there any more other than those 4 that I'm not thinking of right now? There's probably some obscure ones, but those are certainly the 4.
Just the appeal part.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing. If someone, we have had to, if let's say I did not, let's say something is the zoning administrator's discretion. Say approval of the zoning permit for a single family home. Single family homes don't go to any other board for any approval. That's a zoning permit application that comes to staff. I review it, our village engineer reviews it. Now, if I deny it, and if the zoning, I'll say I, but if the zoning administrator denies it and the person does not agree with that denial, they can bring that to the ZBA as well. That's the way to appeal the decision of the zoning administrator. And that happened. That happened in Denali Heights a couple of years ago, where we denied not 1, but I think a batch of 15 permit applications because we were not in agreement with the developer as to the applicable design standards for the public roadways. And so we denied those applications. They appealed our denial to the zoning board of appeals. The ruling of the zoning administrator was upheld and the litigation and so one other authority that the zoning board of appeals has is something called design review. I mentioned that the zoning administrator can issue a zoning permit directly for single family and in fact actually 2 family duplexes and single family homes submit their application. We have a set amount of information that has to accompany that. We have to have building elevations, we have to have a site plan, a grading plan, an erosion control plan. Again, the village engineer and the zoning administrator, and I'm working on involving our code enforcement official more in the review and assessment and recommendation of these. The building elevations are important because we have anti-monotony standards. You can't build the same house one after the other. But beyond single and 2 family, all new construction first goes through a process with the zoning board of appeals called design review before a zoning permit can be issued. And zoning permit design review is at its core code compliance. Does this development comply with our rules? And of course, the zoning administrator assists with that by preparing a staff report that identifies here are the requirements. Here's how they're addressing them. But beyond that, the zoning board of appeals can speak to the general appearance of something. And there have been cases where the zoning board of appeals has taken action that resulted in improved architectural design. Camping World, their first proposal to the village of Roscoe was a very bland, generic steel building that we that the zoning board of appeals and the zoning administrator both felt was inappropriate and beneath the character that we were trying to develop for the village. And by the zoning board of appeals saying, no, this is not good enough, that really empowered staff to work with that applicant to say, if you have to come back with something better if this is to move forward. And if you've been out to see Camping World there at Rockton and Willowbrook, it's an attractive building. And I think searching for the win-win, it's still largely a steel building, but it's really interesting. It's done with different colors, with different sizes and spacing of the ribbing on the steel panels, different orientation, horizontal, vertical, projections on it to create shadow lines. And then on the main facade, a different exterior. There is stone treatment to the exterior of the front entry, and there's a nice entry that was developed. Just recently at our last zoning board of appeals meeting, they picked up on it's something as simple as an addition to a car wash, like extending the bay of an automatic car wash. They picked up on, they felt was a discrepancy in the type of masonry unit that was being used from the existing building to the new. And the applicant was not present in that case, but they laid it over, and we'll hear it again July 12th and discuss it further. But they can exercise requests based on materials and appearance of the building as well. So it's a powerful organization. Joe, can you speak to their recommendation as it moves on to the board, whether they recommend approval or denial has ramifications for the way it's voted upon here, does it
I
not?
was gonna say, first of all, too, is in the village of Roscoe and most other communities around here, our ZBA is a recommending body.
Correct.
So they have a hearing recommendation onto the board, and the board makes the final decision.
Mhm.
That's not necessarily across the state of Illinois, it's not necessarily the same everywhere. We particularly here, because of our size, because of our general location up here, that's how this board has been set up and how it happens. So just realize that there a recommendation coming on to you.
Correct.
I think you're going finding effects too. So when we have variance and we have special use, actually any of those items, special use permits, map amendments, there are certain findings that are required, that board is required to have a public hearing and then make a decision and make findings, does this meet X, Y, and Z? And those findings of facts are required in our ordinance, some of them are in the statutes, some are just certain ordinances.
So they're established statewide, are they not?
Generally, and the specific wording is a little bit different in each of them, but yeah, there's findings, does this meet the, I can't think of them offhand, but give an example.
So a lot of them are broad and general, like just common sense things like, will the development impede the adequate distribution of natural sunlight? Will the development impede access to fresh air? Like some of them are very broad and you would think just a common sense thing. Like, of course, we were not going to approve something that's blocking sunlight or preventing access to clean air. But some are higher thresholds. I will tell you, like the first two in a variance request, the first two findings of fact. Again, the findings of fact they're the same. There's 7 of them, I think, for a variance request. And what the ZBA has to do is basically affirm them. Say, yes, it meets, the proposed variance request meets with these 7 conditions, these 7 findings of fact. The first 2 are that the request is based that compliance with ordinance would result in a hardship as opposed to a mere inconvenience. In other words, if I have to comply with ordinance, it's hurting me in some way. It's adversely impacting me, and I have to demonstrate why that is. And simply saying, I just want to do it, I just don't want to comply, really shouldn't meet the threshold.
And so for variances, that's very, like you said, it's very difficult to find that, is it more than just a inconvenience? You see that a lot with sheds, right? Have a small shed, I want to have a bigger shed than I'm supposed to have in the ordinance. Okay, I'm not allowed to have a bigger shed in my property. And this is what we see all the time. We used to see a lot more. Is that more inconvenience, or is it really something that particular to that property? That's what you're looking at on this. Particular to that specific property, is there something about that property that makes compliance with our code of ordinances?
Well,
zoning code.
Yeah, that's the second condition, if you
Yeah.
don't mind me saying.
Oh, there we go.
And almost hand in hand with the inconvenience factor, but then also the second one is the property upon which the request is being made generally unique from other properties in that same zoning district. So there's something about this property that makes it harder.
And that's really the crux of the whole variance process is you're looking at, and you'll see our variances, you'll see other communities' variances. Sometimes it's a hard standard to prove, and sometimes maybe it doesn't meet that standard, but you're really looking at, and you should be looking at that particular property. Is there something special about it? There's something particular about the exact property that would make it not necessarily able to comply directly with our code, that you have to have some sort of, topography. Maybe it's in a cul-de-sac where there's a weird setback, or there's sometimes corner lots, you'll see that sometimes, or is it so much in a floodplain maybe that building right up to that property line, maybe that doesn't work. But yeah, it really has to be particular to that property. So if you have a subdivision with all the same parcels, right? They're all, 40 feet, whatever it is, 50 feet wide, 70 feet wide. If they're all the same, and one person says, well, I can't comply with your ordinances because my property is special. You really should look at that and say, okay, is this actually something about this property, or is it just the property owner wants to do something more than they're supposed
I'll
to?
tell you, it is in the eye of the beholder. So those are discretionary, these are subjective evaluations.
Yep.
They are.
But the key of this is that zoning board has to find all in the affirmative of all of those findings. They have to say, yes, it's not because of the shape, topography, because of the uniqueness of the property, because of it's not based on exclusively for desire to increase value or income potential.
Yeah.
That's not a valid reason for variance. Not detrimental to public welfare, that's just easy. And it won't make any or supply a light, air, adjacent properties, or substantially increase congestion.
Another reason that I don't think is appropriate, I don't think it's generally what we should be considering, but it comes up a lot. And again, just by way of background, I was on Rockford Zoning Board of Appeals for 11 years before taking the position here. So I've got a lot of experience on the Zoning Board of Appeals. You'll hear a lot of people say as their reason to want a variance is saying, I just can't afford it. I can't afford the cost of what it would be to comply. Generally speaking, that's not good enough. There might be times when you find that it is for some reason, but people couldn't be able to almost spend themselves into a hardship. Like no one's making them initiate whatever it is they're trying to do. And like, so by saying, I want to undertake this project, but I can't afford to do it completely right, or I can't afford to completely comply. No.
What about precedent? Like some example you had about the shed. All right, somebody said we did this, it got through to ZBA. Now you're setting precedent that somebody.
Every property,
Nope.
because it's variance, every property, you're looking at that specific property, and do those findings meet that specific property? So you'll get that sometimes. I hear people say, well, all my neighbors have that. Great, but the ZBA in their wisdom and their review about other neighbor properties, they rightfully found some specific thing that was different about those other properties. So it's really not precedent.
From time to time, I'll remind our ZBA that every application is unique,
Yep.
needs to be evaluated only on its own merits. And I've heard some of them say, well, if we say yes, we'll have to say yes to everyone afterwards. That's not the case. John Gilberti drummed that into my head a long time ago, that every single one.
And it's because for variance, you're looking at that uniqueness of the property.
Right? If you said yes to 5 in a row, you could say no to the next one, or vice versa.
However, what I will point out, though, we've done a good job changing this when we did a rezoning rewrite. If you are seeing as a board, you're seeing and you're granting variance upon variance upon variance for the same thing, the same type of properties, maybe your code should be changed.
Yep.
If you're continuing to grant these variances, first of all, I probably shouldn't be granting them. But if you're receiving the same types of requests, I suppose, or in this case, a lot of cases, you're granting those same requests. Sheds was a good example. I think some of the setbacks we've had in the past, then maybe it's time to look at your code and change those. So instead of just keep on granting the variances, change the code itself that applies to everybody. That's what I mean. I was stressed that a lot because we've had for a long time, we had the same variances coming in, and finally we had the zoning rewrite. Scott got involved fairly recently in the history of the village, I guess, but as zoning administrator, and we've changed the code to make it work for the village, what we actually want, right? The board, you're approving these variances, you think that these things should be this way, and change the actual underlying code. That's a big stressor. And so I guess back to the original question, or original point Scott was saying was that if they, zoning board passes approves it and said, they vote it and say, yep, we want to grant this variance, we make these findings of facts, and they have to make those and write them down and transfer them to you. Then it's just a concurrence of a majority of all members of the village. So it's just a majority vote by you to approve a variance. If the village board, or sorry, if the ZBA denies a variance, that actually increases the threshold of the vote here to 2/3 of all trustees. So 4 trustees have to approve the variance. And because you're approving that variance, you as board are saying, you know what, we think the ZBA was wrong. We're going to approve this variance, we think it should be approved. The same findings are required. So if you're going to overturn the ZBA and say, you know, ZBA, you said that we don't think this meets these findings or meets the requirements for variance, then this board here has to craft those findings and say, okay, here's why we think this is this property, the topography, all those little items on there. So just realize you have, the findings are still required.
Generally reverse them, but yeah.
Yeah.
We always had to, on the fly, if we were going, let's say, against the staff recommendation or something, like in the city of Rockford, and we do it as well, the staff prepares the findings of fact to accompany their recommendation, right? But those have to be voted on. Those are part of the vote for the recommendation of approval or denial. But if ZBA is going against staff, or if the board ends up going against what the ZBA says, we would always ask for you to amend the findings of fact. Essentially kind of reverse those instead of saying this is not based upon a desire for blah, blah, blah. And you would say it is indeed based upon that desire. So we can't affirm the finding. Look, if Joe and I can tell that something like that is ever a likelihood or a possibility, we could probably have an alternate set of findings of fact ready to go. And so for whichever way you were to vote, you could have an alternate set of findings of fact that's deny rather than affirm.
Yeah.
How about if you remember the 2007 variance of the fence, the 6-foot high fence? And what was the name of the street? Where the people had complained that the children couldn't see, that once a variance given is a variance forever.
That's a good one, sure.
Type of thing.
Just recently on a property on a cul-de-sac here in the village, a neighbor had communicated to us on a couple of occasions. One of the houses on the entrance to the cul-de-sac, like the cul-de-sac, the road came in, made a bend to the cul-de-sac, and the house right there on the bend has a 6-foot fence around their whole backyard. But since it's a corner lot, corner lots have what we consider to be 2 front yards. That's a tough concept for a lot of residents to understand. We think of yards in terms of space in front of or beside or behind our house. A front yard is, we all grew up, a front yard is between your house and the street. Not if you have a corner lot, not from a zoning standpoint. If you're on a corner lot, the front yard setback is simply an area on your property when your property is adjacent to a public right of way. So corner lots have 2 front yard setbacks. It is a more restrictive property. Because of that, our ordinance requires that corner lots be X% larger than other lots when a subdivision is platted to accommodate for additional restrictions on the usable space. One of our rules is that in the front yard setback, a fence can only be 4 feet high. We have since in our new zoning rewrite drilled down much more on fencing, and we've said in that front yard setback, the fence can only be 4 feet high, and it must be at least 50% transparent. Right, so it can be a picket style fence, and the spacing must equal the width of the picket, or like a aluminum or wrought iron style fence. But you can't do a solid sight screen 4-foot fence in the front yard setback anymore. We've also prohibited the use. There's no galvan or no chain link fencing allowed in the front yard setback, and if it's in the rear yards, it must be vinyl coated. We don't allow bare galvanized chain link fencing anymore. It has to be green or black vinyl coated. some other color if they wanted to propose it. So that's a variance request we get sometimes. I'm a corner lot and I want to build my fence in what I perceive to be my backyard from my house going backwards. And maybe that includes that front yard setback. There are times when that's appropriate. There's times when we approve that. I don't need to get into that right now. But this resident, the adjacent resident was complaining that the 6-foot fence in the front yard setback, and that's what this person had, was obscuring views of kids riding bikes in the cul-de-sac, or playing in the cul-de-sac. And a quick glance of ordinance or of records didn't reveal any variance that had been authorized. So we sent him a notice of violation. He came in very quickly after that with his approved variance that he got in 2007. We found it then. We had better search information, but we didn't tag everything. Stuff that old isn't really tagged and all that searchable in our database. So it was a tough find. But it absolutely was approved. It was approved by the ZBA and by the board in 2007. And nothing has changed since then. The development hasn't changed. The subdivision hasn't changed. Nothing has happened. So I brought it to Joe, and Joe and I talked about it. And essentially, the actions of the board that approved variance stands and is still in effect. And without something new having happened to change the criteria upon which that was approved, it can stay. Now, we really looked at it in detail, and I went out and took photos of it. I did it from the car, so you see the driver's line of sight. I will say in good conscience, even if we took it down to 4 feet, it does not change the line of sight into the cul-de-sac. It's an offset cul-de-sac, meaning you don't just drive into it and it expands in both directions. All of the curvature of it is off to one side, and the fence does obscure the view of a sliver of it. But reducing it down to 4 feet, which is probably was the requested action, wouldn't change that line of sight. In any event, in this case, the variance stands. The fence is permissible. The person built the fence based upon the approvals granted by the board, and it remains in place.
Quick question. I live in a subdivision where we have an HOA. Fences aren't allowed. How is the precedence of village versus the HOA?
Okay, this just came, yeah, we just kind of discussing this today. That's not the question, but we're just talking about this for a different subdivision, actually. Actually for the property, a property we're buying, actually. The property we have, actually, the property we're purchasing on Main Street actually has a conditions, has a restrictions for some uses. Point is though, is that the HOA and your covenants and restrictions on your property, those are essentially a contract between you and all of your neighbors on that in your subdivision, and developer in theory, the town you it is, but between you, the developer, and all your neighbors. The enforcing party of those are your neighbors or you, right? It's a contract, right? Somebody says that you're building a fence, you're not supposed to, it says your HOA or your covenants say no fence, and you build a fence. That's in breach of contract with your neighbors, not with the village. The village, so there's two separate issues. It's the private issue between the contract between you and your neighbors, and then it's the what can you do with the village. So the village can say, yep, you're allowed to build a 4-foot fence. You show us your plans, it meets that, great, okay. We'll approve that if you meet our village ordinance. Now, if you build that, you're not supposed to, or you have an agreement with your neighbors not to build that kind of contractual agreement with your neighbors not to build that, then that's between your neighbors, and your neighbors can sue you, bring you to court, and that's how that gets enforced. So there really are two fully separate issues. So that comes up a lot. It really does come up a lot. And it's really two completely separate issues. Just because the village approves something or approves that you meet the village code for an item, doesn't mean that the agreement you've made privately with your neighbors goes out the window. I mean, there's certain things, obviously, there's racial discrimination, I think, and or not, I think there is, and then there's a couple other types of restrictions on the covenants, but generally, it's a contract with you and your neighbors.
No,
You can contract no one you want to.
only thing I'll add, and that's perfect, is that if we are aware of them, we'll advise
Yeah.
the applicant.
Yeah.
There were some weird ones in Denali that surprised us that came up. There was, I think no above ground pools was one. And someone came in with an above ground pool application, and We said, the village of Roscoe will issue you a zoning permit. We have nothing in our ordinance that would allow us to deny that if it complies with the setback and the fencing and the security aspects that are established in ordinance. But we are aware that your neighborhood has recorded covenants and restrictions, so is this something you want to do? Is this kind of a risk you want to take? And then they could say yes or no, and then that would, right?
And now, a slightly different thing is the easements. So that's something, so I'm kind of confusing maybe, or confusion happens with what's an easement versus what's right of way versus what's your property versus not your property. But, and we see this too with utility easements, but most of you have on your properties have probably a utility easement on there. It's a marked off area on your property. It says this is being, essentially it's permission, it's written permission to the utility. Maybe it's,
Used by someone else.
yeah, right, it's used by somebody else, so it's a type of ownership really, but it's your property. But it's you giving your property permission, written permission, recorded on the property to the utility to come on there to repair, to install. Maybe there's some access easements throughout the village, there's some emergency access easements throughout the village. Quite a few actually.
Of course, drainage and stormwater.
And drainage and stormwater easements that are recorded on the properties that say, and this is where it comes into play of people don't necessarily look at the documents or when they're purchasing their house, they're very excited, they don't necessarily look at what's actually on there. But there are restrictions and you've agreed to those restrictions when you come in. And those are restrictions granted to, or those easements are granted to the village. So in that case, the contract is between the village and you, or between the utility and you. So in that case, the village would enforce that. The village is the enforcing body of that, or the utility company is the enforcing body. Because part of that agreement, the contract again, is between you and the.
Let me give a specific example of what Joe's talking about, fencing. Now, again, as you said, easements are granting the right of use on private property to someone. The stormwater, the drainage easements are essentially granted to the village of Roscoe. We're the ones charged with maintaining an orderly stormwater conveyance network, whether that's ditches, storm sewers, above or below ground. Whatever we approve as part of the construction documents for the plat, we have authority to ensure that that stays in place and functions. That means access to inspect, or if it's surface drainage, we can prohibit anything being constructed because it could block the flow of water. That's granted to us. Utility easements are really granted more in a blanket fashion to all of the public utilities. That's not us. So for a fence, if someone wanted to put it in a drainage easement, we can just say, no, you can't do it. Won't allow it, can't do it. If they want to put a fence in a utility easement, and plenty of people do, we tell them there's a utility easement there. We make them aware of it. We tell them that they are building at their own risk. And we make them sign a waiver that is recorded against the property, a waiver of them acknowledging that I am building this at my own risk. And if a utility company needs to come take my fence apart, there is no obligation for them to rebuild it or to compensate me for that. And that has happened. There was utility work done 2 summers ago in Chicory Ridge. And I think they had to impact 7 or 8 people's fences that were constructed in the utility easements. They were wonderful. They didn't just blast through them. They deconstructed the fences. They would remove a fence panel. They set it neatly off to the side to gain access to where they needed to be. It was even kind of nicer than they almost needed to be. Right? They could have taken a chainsaw and just cut a clear path if they wanted to, but they didn't put them back. They didn't reconstruct them. That was on the property owners. We got a lot of phone calls. You're right. A lot of people, Joe was right. I think a lot of people buy a house without knowing about the easements on it. You wouldn't know unless you really had a chance to see your plat. And that's something we do in each and every zoning permit application is check the plat and then usually make an excerpt of that person's property from their plat. Show them, hey, here's the easement issues you have to deal with here.
Another related to that is rights of way. Because that's sort of the same issue, really briefly, but same that's sort of the public. So the easement is a private agreement between the village, developer, utility, whoever, property owner. Right of way is dedicated property to the village. That is village, essentially village property. And we see this a lot not just on the streets, but we'll see this a lot maybe in front of people's houses where they have their mailboxes. They've got elaborate stone and plantings and things on there. And many people have their lawn, their front lawn, go right up to the roadway, but the roadway be over that right of way portion of it. A lot of those lawns or decorations or sprinklers are actually on village property in that case. And so our snow plows go by, or we have to dig up something or to clean up something. It damages that. You'll hear complaints. You'll hear complaints
Almost the
occasionally.
first 15 to 18 feet, depending on the
Yeah,
right of way width,
yeah.
from the road edge into your property. That first 15 to 18 feet is public property.
Yep. Yeah, so that's typically an easement. Easement to your property that allows somebody else to go on it. That's village property. So, we usually we don't clear them off. We don't, go out there looking for those problems, but just realize that you'll see those as trustees. You'll see that occasionally come through. He'll come up through their sprinklers or their
So
mailbox or their decorations.
Brandon's gonna send it, as President Gustafson pointed out, Brandon will send out advance notices that work will be happening for a residential streets program. Part of that will be to notify everyone if they have private improvements, specifically irrigation systems, if they're located in the public right of way, that they should relocate those as soon as possible. I've seen when a contractor can, sometimes they can gently pull the head and line up and set it off to the side so that it can just be easily reburied. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes excavation is just, if we're doing any kind of a widening, sometimes it just takes that irrigation head off and it's gone. It is not the village's responsibility to repair and replace those in the public right of way. We try to give people a heads up beforehand. Every year, somebody will call and say, you owe me $700 or $300.
So question, the sidewalks on Main Street, is that part of the easement or is that the land responsibility for that sidewalk?
Well, depends.
Is that be like right at the?
That's a complex question. Maybe, and I'm not, the sidewalks almost always exist in the public right of way. However, more often than not, they are the responsibility of the adjacent property owner. Same thing as a driveway. It's our property, right? But we're letting you, homeowner or neighbor or collection of homeowners, we're letting you use it. We're letting you build that portion of your driveway that connects to our public street. We're letting you construct a sidewalk for the mutual benefit and enjoyment of the people.
And that's the key, right? For rights of way, it's not the village's property, it's your property, right? It's the public's property. So that's a little different. That's the difference on that, right? It's the public's property versus the property we're buying on Main Street or the village hall, which is the village's property. It's our private village's property, essentially, rough plus or minus, but the rights of way are the public's in general's property. So that's the difference. I guess that's what we're looking at.
Some people take it to an extreme and they'll say, if that's the city's property, then I'm not mowing it.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna mow the corner of my property.
Well, yeah,
That's not how it works.
It's the public's job.
And even sidewalk repair replacement is generally on the property owner. It is their responsibility to keep it in a safe condition. We do annual inspections. We try to identify, we have a threshold measurements of different failures, different flaws in a sidewalk that rise to the level of needing action. Now in residential zoning, we have a 50-50 program. They can apply for reimbursement of 50% of any costs associated with repairing their sidewalk. That doesn't apply to commercial. Now but why I thought it was a complicated question is there are areas where we, the village, have decided sidewalk is in the best interest when it was not originally required. It could be, we recently did it at an intersection in Shepherd's Hills where different plats all came together at an intersection and they were developed at different standards. Some were to the rural standards, some were to the urban. So there was both an asphalt recreational path and then coming in from two sides of it, there was concrete sidewalk, but the corner house wasn't part of the plat. So the sidewalks all stopped. And it really, because it wasn't, those plats weren't developed in such a way where sidewalk was required, it's not a requirement we could put on those homeowners. The village advanced sidewalk construction in those areas. I think we have in fact looked for opportunities on Main Street when there was existing gaps in the overall sidewalk connectivity where we've jumped in ourselves to close the gap and put a piece in. Everyone, again, it's like everyone's unique. Every property probably has its own set of circumstances as to what was required at the time of construction or what's the obligation of the present and current property owner.
Bring expectations now too, as to how people want to move about.
Yeah.
And how far and why they want to move about.
The same intersection we're talking about where we had residential and we completed the sidewalks for the intersection for the intersection. We didn't even identify the issue because there was a lot of empty lots still. And as those lots finished and as each property was built, more and more sidewalk was connected. It got to the corner house and the sidewalk ran into a fence. So not only did that house not have a sidewalk, they had built their fence out into the public right of way. So this sidewalk that's in the public right of way is now running smack dab into a fence. And that's a tough one. We had to have a meeting, an unfortunate meeting to have with the property owner who ended up being very understanding that, hey, your fence is in the public right of way and it has to be moved. And unfortunately for him, he even had like playground equipment and stuff up against the fence, that everything had to be relocated and the fence moved. I think, again, we helped a little bit. I think we helped disassemble the fence, but didn't pay any money and didn't help to reassemble it. That was just an interesting little corner.
I have one final thing, and the same term, very final. Grandfather, the term grandfathered in, we hear this all the time. It's sort of the same topic of this is, you hear things, oh, is this property grandfathered in with the zoning or grandfathered in with the use on the property? Answer is, it's not really a thing. I mean, it is you'll see it, but it's a non-conforming use. So
That's not my upcoming presentation.
oh, is it? Sorry, I won't say anymore.
No.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, because broadly, let's just say, let's leave it as broadly, it's a misused term.
Yes, it's misused term. It's, yes, if zoning changes or use changes, or sorry, the zoning changes, the code, the law changes. Yes, we allow you to continue on using that property for how you were using it until something else changes, until your use of that changes, then you have to follow the current new law. So that's a general idea of it. So you're not automatically just allowed to do something forever.
People say, no, that's grandfathered in. They just say it because they've heard that from Law and Order or something, and it's not, it's almost always not the case. It's almost always an inappropriate.
We have a future topic.
Yeah. But and one thing I have to do as zoning administrator is I get. I have to prepare zoning verification letters, often for sale of a property, part of a title search or part of a new mortgage or something. And it's the zoning administrator affirming whether or not the property complies with current ordinance. And then pointing out where it might not, what deficiencies there might be. People will sometimes request what's kind of referred to as a tear down letter or a burn down letter. If this were to burn down, could it be built back in the exact same way? And often I'll have to say, no, it couldn't be. It's an existing non-conforming. It can exist as long as it stands as is, but if something were to happen, it could not be built back in that same way. Carol, I'm sorry.
Mr. Insurance Guy.
Yeah.
Wasn't his case, he changed the parking lot, went from a residential area to a commercial use. And so since he changed the configuration of what would be a driveway into a parking lot, he couldn't say that he was grandfathered or, oh, why do I have to do it when Roscoe Glass across the street doesn't have to? He had changed the manner in which he was using property. So
Right.
our
Yep.
current ordinance.
And he was new construction. New construction ordinance will always apply, and we will one at a time catch up with old properties as they, if Roscoe Glass does not have curb and gutter. When the time comes, if they have to reconstruct the parking lot, it would have to be brought into compliance. So I want to conclude for tonight, and in the pattern we've established at the next committee of the whole, any questions you have about the information presented tonight, the sort of general zoning stuff, feel free to ask those. And I just want to tell you what I think are appropriate future presentations that deserve their own, I think, combined parking and loading requirements and landscaping. They're robust sections. There's a lot to our landscaping ordinance. And it might be interesting to learn how different parking requirements are established. So parking, loading, and landscaping. Signage definitely deserves its own. We have a very complex signage ordinance. Existing non-conforming, which we just sort of took a peek at tonight, and maybe even covered, who knows? And then planned unit developments. planned unit developments deserve a full conversation because a planned unit development is someone, a developer coming forward with a large tract of land and saying, I want to essentially create my own specific rules of engagement, my own specific zoning ordinance for this property based upon a clearly communicated vision of what that property will be. So they have to be very specific. Now, it's supposed to even contemplate these, it's supposed to be because it is somehow what they're proposing to do, while it might not conform strictly with ordinance, it somehow is to the benefit to the village or the general welfare of the community. Say we want to do a very eco-friendly residential development that results in smaller lots than we generally allow, but it's because there's an offset because they're providing more vegetative bioswale water treatment or something. We've only, well, I don't know if we've only, there's only one, there's a big one that I'm aware of, and basically the entire development of everything around Schnucks, right? The entire retail complex, even going back into all of the multifamily development that we have been engaging with over this process of the township. All of that was one big planned unit development. Actually, it was probably a sequence of 2 or 3 planned unit developments. But you set your rules. You say, here's what we want to build, down to the size of the buildings, the arrangement of everything, where there's sidewalks, where there's landscaping, everything. It's a complex procedure that we don't go through often, but yes.
I have 2 questions.
Yep.
One, I think this is really informative. I think it's great. I think we cover a lot of ground. So in the future, can we limit this to like 30 minutes and then go? No, I'm serious.
I don't know how long I went. I'm
No,
sorry.
but if, here's, I love it. I think if it has to go on, I'd rather have zoning part 1, zoning part 2, you know, and go that way, because I'm drinking through a fire hose. And the next question I have for everyone is, there going to be a test? And when will that be? Dane is gonna, it's to be on the
I don't do.
Yes,
step.
there will be a test.
There is a test every time we have a zoning action. It's okay, the first one.
Very good.
Thank you.
Public comment? No need for executive session. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Petty, seconded by
Second.
Mike Simon there. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned. And Mike, I will go on.
No, it's like.
That was interesting.
I was interested. I mean, I was gonna say.
I think you get up.
What's that?
Yeah, there's a bunch, but I'm just saying, after a while, you're like. Where we at?
Annexation that we've done.
It's me too, but like, I don't know, at the presentation before, like, I love talking about this.
Me too. I don't- but-
I don't know.
I think it's something that, you know, we just gotta, after.
Yeah, after 3 hours,
It was really kind of hard figuring out whether to do it.
Because there was another one out there.
Now,
I know it's just discussion.
Oh, yeah.
I thought there was another one. I need to almost that list, shopping list. 50 inches.
Like 110.
But although it's good of you to